Hello and welcome to the session, Tackling Teams and SharePoint Site Sprawl, Why It Matters and What You Need to Know. This is for the Scottish Summit, so I hope that you guys are having a really great time at the event. I'm sorry I can't be there in person, as I'm sure many people are with COVID and the pandemic that we're experiencing. But this particular session I find really interesting because if you chose one problem that I see the most frequently across every customer of every size, it is the issue of how they're tackling sprawl and often what we consider quite obvious gaps not being addressed. So I hope that there's some really great insights in here if this is new to you. If it's not new to you, I hope there's some really great things that you see as opportunities for a follow-up discussion, so that I can learn more and that we can both improve, from a community perspective, how we solve and tackle these challenges. So with that, I'm going to dive right in. Again, a big thank you to the sponsors for events like this. I also wanted to just thank the speakers. I know I am one of them, but speakers are really friendly people. And I can tell you from having been in this industry for a long time, if you reach out to speakers, they are almost certainly going to give you time and energy and focus. So please reach out. If you reach out to me, we can have a one-on-one discussion. We can dive deeper into your current state, what are your current challenges, and I can be prescriptive with my guidance, which I can't do, at scale, right, in an organizational or presentation setting like this. So please reach out. I'm super friendly. And then if you have questions about Microsoft Roadmap or things that, I do a lot of strategy with a lot of customers, it also can't hurt in a more private setting because I can kind of share what other customers like yours are working their way through, or from a personal perspective, what I would do from a career management direction for yourself. So again, there's no questions that are bad. Please reach out on LinkedIn or email, and I'd love to have a chat. So with that, let's talk about the discussion today: managing workspace sprawl. So the digital workplace has workspaces, and sprawl is a fundamental challenge with those spaces, whether it's Microsoft Teams, SharePoint, or whether it's something like Yammer Communities. So we're going to talk about this from a managed provisioning, governance, and navigation perspective. I want to make sure we're all on the same page with the fundamental problem. The problem we experience today is that we create these wonderful SharePoint sites and teams, and when we create a lot of them, it's more and more challenging to understand who created it, why they created it, what does it relate to? Does it relate to a department? Does it relate to a product, a division? Does it relate to a client? It becomes more and more challenging to know these things in an organization as the organization both grows and the spaces that exist in the organization grows. Out of the box, the experiences for navigating these spaces are just not sufficient, right? If you take an organization like ours, we're 30 to 40 people, we're not a big organization, and I can tell you it is a chore to try and navigate all of the various spaces and sites that exist within our organization, just with the word sales in them, right? And you can see that a real example here. The subtle difference here is obviously some of them we've icons or use terms to make sure that they're differentiated, but in a lot of organizations they don't do that effectively, and so it can be a really big challenge to see what spaces exist. If you've ever yourself used Teams in an organization of a certain size, you know what I'm talking about, because you have so many teams that are hidden that it's really difficult to navigate to them or catch up on what's been changing across those teams. And this, of course, is the same problem we see in SharePoint. Not so much on communication sites or publishing sites. Those are often represented in the intranet navigation, but the collaborative sites often do not have an effective navigation pattern. You might think, well, yes, that's the truth on the the end user or the front end of it, but what about the back end? I'm sure the administrators, they have a better experience. They do not. If you're an administrator and you are managing an environment like this, it's actually far worse, because you only have the site name, maybe the type of site, who the owner was or creator of it. So you have some basic information, but if you wanted to know which department it relates to, which does it relate to clients, does it relate to confidential information, a lot of that information is most likely missing, right? Your own way to manage these teams and SharePoint sites and Yammer communities, they're restricted by the lack of information that you have. And that's really the fundamental difference between managed and unmanaged, right? Managed is where I kind of know at least what these spaces are, and then I can take some proactive action on it. I can be more effective in my management of it. Unmanaged is there's unknowns about it, and that makes it more challenging. And this is going to get worse over time. So if you haven't really fully embraced Microsoft Teams, when you do that, Microsoft Teams encourages a more flatter structure. Not only Teams, but arguably all of the online modeling. And just as we should move forward in our ecosystems, we know that flatter is better for a lot of reasons. And so if you flatten your structures, and moving forward, you keep that flattened model, which you absolutely should. It makes it easier for end users because they can look at Project A, know that these are the members of Project A, and they all have the same general permissions. Yes, there's private channels within that, but generally speaking, there's a, in this team or a subset of this team, we have access to these resources. What happens is when you have a Project B and a Project A and you want to share resources between them, the fundamental design of Microsoft Teams is to encourage you to create a Project AB team. And then that Project AB team would be a structured space where both Project A and B members are together, and then they can share those assets across them. Now this, without getting into other complicated reasons why this kind of affects sprawl, it certainly affects sprawl because it creates more spaces than a historic model where you have hierarchies. If you think of SharePoint, it's more likely that you might break inheritance, which again is not a good idea, but it's something we've done for many years, and that would avoid us having to create a new digital space to do that sharing. We would just be breaking inheritance or doing a guest link or something like that. And so for a lot of use cases in the organization today, you need to create these dedicated sharing spaces over time for scaling reasons, and that creates more demand. It also doesn't just create more of these spaces, but the functionality of something like, say, the private channels that we mentioned earlier is actually a little bit insidious in the way it affects sprawl. Because what ends up happening is Project A, a private A channel, does not need to have the Project A owner in it. You can have a subset of users that don't include the owner as a private channel. When you do that, as an example, it will break this model of assumption that the Project A owner knows all of the spaces that exist. Project A channel private is also a site collection of its own, which creates more spaces on the back end. So without going into all the technical reasons why this is challenging, it is fundamentally a bigger problem today than it ever has been in the past. I cannot express enough how important sprawl is as a positive. Sprawl is an indication of adoption. It's unmanaged sprawl that we want to manage effectively. We want to transition from unmanaged sprawl to managed sprawl. That's my ask to you. That's what I'm trying to drive awareness of today, and I'm going to give you tools to do that. Now, this unmanaged sprawl has huge implications of cost, right? When you don't have effective naming because you're not automating the provisioning, because you don't know things like which departments and does it relate to a project, does it relate to X or Y, it means you're going to get a lot of sites and teams that are called operations or management or other general terms, and it's going to be very difficult for you to tell which ones relate to which of these categories I was mentioning. Is it the HR management team? Is it the employee file management, performance management team? You have 3 sites that are called management or teams that are called management, and they may or may not be named effectively, so you can tell based on the naming of the site. It's also very unclear if it's official or unofficial. Was this site created on purpose for that? Is it been abandoned, which happens a lot with sites? Someone creates a team or a site structure because they think we need this space, and then they find out a little bit later that there's an existing one. They move themselves and their work over to that, and all of a sudden this thing stays there for a long time because no one can tell whether or not it actually should still exist, because again, it's not well labeled. There's no metadata or context around it. We don't know who the business sponsor is. We just know who created it, as an example. And if that person leaves, it makes it even harder for us to address whether or not there's valuable content in this site that is not replicated somewhere else. Now, this is fundamentally a challenge too, because that owner example I gave isn't as simple as saying, do we have 2 owners, right? Which is what we should always ask. Do we have 2 owners for our Microsoft team or 2 owners for our SharePoint site? Because that way we have a bit of redundancy. The reason we ask that question isn't just because we want to know about owners, but we want to understand the role of the owner, right? Is it that the actual person who might approve access or certainly approve whether something should be archived, like a whole collection, is actually not either of those technical owners, but a business sponsor? And it just so happens that they wanted someone else to be the technical owner because they're not going to manage permissions and things like that. And so they wanted, they still are involved in those decisions, etc., but they wanted someone else to manage that. This happens quite frequently in organizations. So out of the box, there's no way for us to track whether a person's a sponsor versus an owner. And there's really no way out of the box to also tell if something has enough or sufficient number of owners based on our own compliance or rules for risk mitigation, right, from management. At the same time, we have a lot of redundancy. I mentioned, a lot of these sites that get recreated with similar names, but it also creates inconsistencies, right? Because we're not helping them create these spaces. We're not templating and automatically creating these spaces for them. So if they're using the various ways, 20 plus ways to create these spaces out of the box, what it's going to lead to is a lot of inconsistencies inconsistencies from a design, from a flow, from what should be in those spaces. That makes it both much more expensive to manage these, right? If you want to update a template, right, and apply that to all the sites that should have been based on that template, or all the teams that are based on that template, it's obviously much easier if we have that in the first place. If you don't have that referencing, it's extremely difficult to update things in scale in mass across the organization like that. Similarly, as a user, it's quite fatiguing, right, to go from one team that works a certain way where they always have a sync channel, and that's where all the weekly syncs and the meetings and all those things, they all occur in the channel. That's great because it reduces the noise of the general channel, but maybe that only happens with some teams, not all teams, right? That's something we could really help encourage by templating more effectively, as an example, which would both improve digital excellence and improve the user experience. You could also argue, and it's a pretty good argument, that loss of control and data risk loss are much more substantial when we have unmanaged. Think about it. I don't know the confidentiality levels of these spaces and sites and teams. Even if you had a suggestion of that confidentiality, you don't know appropriate metadata that would help you target them effectively. As an example, I might see that it's high confidentiality, but I don't know if it's related to HR, finance, or other types of departments. By asking a simple question like, which does this team relate to finance, or which department does this relate to, and someone acknowledging that it makes that tie to finance or HR, etc., all of a sudden we can target retention and we can target protection scenarios at a much more specific level with labels and the out-of-the-box capabilities of Microsoft 365. That would be much harder for us to do without that. Another big one here is essentially this challenge of, we've already kind of talked about navigation with my example earlier of navigating teams, but it's actually quite challenging for adoption too, because you think about it this way: if we're not templating and creating these spaces consistently, it also means we're probably not proactively training people. When you create your first time you've ever created a Microsoft team, right? How are we onboarding people to that experience? Not the Microsoft onboarding, right? The messaging from our organization saying, here's the training, here's the mentorship, here's the champions in our organization that know how to do this well. Here's why we crafted your site in the way that we did. Here's, it's been 2 weeks. We've noticed that you've had the site for a little bit. This is what we commonly find people want to explore. It's been a month. Have you looked at your usage data? Here's links to your usage data, right? You could do all these kind of drip-fed campaigns and things like that if you had sort of a registry of your sites that you could act upon. But if you're not managing those sites, you don't have something that represents what I just described. And you certainly don't have something where you can target particular departments across the whole organization, or target, all the sites that relate to projects or products or something like that, whereas you could, if you manage Sprawl effectively. So, yes, please, for the love of God, manage Sprawl. And now, hopefully, you're, leaning forward and you're intent on learning how to do that today. One last comment. I want to be cognizant of the fact that a lot of organizations have tried to manage Sprawl, but they've struggled. And yes, there's some great examples of reasons for that on the left. Those reasons are from Registry, which is a great vendor in this space that helps solve these management problems. And so there are reasons that this has happened. If you don't know this, there's 20 plus ways to create a group, team, or site today. Think about that for a moment. There's 20 plus UX models, ways in which you can create those sites. So even if you did the right things and you made it so that, we added this extra field that you have to fill out inside of the SharePoint site creation process, you might have missed it in those many other places people can create sites from. And so this is why fundamentally the answer can't be allow users to use the out-of-the-box creation experiences, because you really need to have a way to ask those key questions early, capture that information to keep a directory or a registry up to date, and then manage it from there. Now, there's an effective way to do that, which we'll talk about today. But again, one of the reasons this has been challenging is because it's been so costly, etc., to do this in the past. Now we know that there are ways to do this that can be literally thousands of dollars. What we're describing as an answer here does not need to be tens of thousands of dollars to solve this problem. So let's talk about managed provisioning. In managed provisioning, what we're really trying to do is make sure the creation process, when you create, whether it's from SharePoint, from Microsoft Teams, when you create a space, that we ask some additional questions. That's sort of the magic missing thing within this experience. If we could ask some additional questions, we could template the environment, we could help provision it, we could make it so that when we create that environment, we do supportive email campaigns or instant messaging. We can do all sorts of drip campaigns to help them with onboarding, with training, with management, with proactive management over time to track, hey, we've noticed some risks, like one of the owners is missing from your site, etc. We can do all of that because we're asking some additional questions at the very beginning of the process. And unfortunately, the out-of-the-box experience only has really basic questions. Name the site, give us essentially an address which is typically defined by the naming, and some sort of vague description. And if you're really lucky, you might even add something like the confidentiality levels, which Microsoft supports out of the box, but without getting into all the details, that's not even asked for consistently across all these experiences. So what does this mean? It means that for very small organizations where an individual in the organization could know arguably what all the sites are, you don't need to customize or work through this. You could just have them be your directory, and then they could manage that in a manual way. If we're over a certain size, typically over 50 to 100 users, once you start to reach those kinds of sizes, the amount of sites and teams and spaces that are created is so significant that it would be impossible for an individual to understand what was created, who created it, and why did they create it. So this is why we want to change this process from using these out-of-the-box forms to using essentially a form that we create that has questions and tailors the experience for the end user. The key with asking those questions is it has to make sense to the end user, and it has to add value. We can't just ask a random question like, does this relate to a product, and never use that on the other side. By them saying it relates to a product, we can assure them, maybe even in the form experience, let them know, if you help us understand this, then what we can do is make sure that when you go to those product pages, you'll be able to navigate to this. If you say it's a project site, it'll be rolled up automatically with recent documents and other things into the project center that we have in our environment, and so on and so forth. You're tying the site together and providing typical experiences like roll-ups and navigation improvements, and hopefully a more tailored template experience to get started with for users, because they're telling you more about the site. So it is definitely give and receive, right, from a building perspective. Now there's lots of ways to potentially do what I'm describing. Out of the box, you can redirect these forms that exist for, say, SharePoint site creation, and there's lots of ways you could build your own forms. You could use Power Apps, which is a pretty often used solution set for saving some cost. You can build SharePoint FX solutions. You could build essentially a Azure website or service that you're redirecting to. You could do all sorts of different things that essentially allows you to ask simple questions in a form, and then by asking those questions, you should hopefully provision the entire site automatically on the back end or the team that has been requested in a more templated way. So there's lots of tools that Microsoft gives us to make the templating easier. There's lots of tools that Microsoft gives us to make it easier to queue and manage the requests that come in, to approve them. And I can't stress enough, Microsoft Lists or SharePoint Lists out of the box is a really great storage solution for a lot of these, unless your organization is extremely large, because it scales, right, to hundreds of thousands of items, no problem. And if we think of the benefits of a list, whether it's Microsoft Lists or SharePoint Lists, it gives us things like columns, filters, views. It gives us versioning. It gives us the built-in approvals and set up with Power Automate, so we can enhance those approvals more. So if you take something like a request list, there's nothing stopping us from also creating a created list, right? A provisioned or existing site list or existing teams list. And when you start to think of it that way, we can actually build a lot of the experiences on the other side for management and for end users by just building it in lists in the first place. So I do think SharePoint Lists and Microsoft Lists are a really great resource within this set of tools to help you build this. Microsoft themselves have built some samples with Power Apps, which we'll talk about. But in general, there's a lot of options here, and I'm not saying you must use one approach or another. They all have pros and cons. I'm just saying you need to not use the out-of-the-box one, please. And the way you do this is you essentially block the ability to create these spaces, except for a few people in the organization, and then those who maybe go through training or something else, where you trust them to create these spaces, who would then reconcile the creation of these spaces with filling out that information on the back end. So they'd still fill out, this form or whatever, but they might go and create the space before or after. Think of like your existing spaces. Maybe you have a couple hundred sites or teams today. You need to also kind of register those in sort of a site directory or a Teams registry in the same way. And that registry that we're describing is essentially what happens after a request, right? You create the request, we manage the request as appropriate, and then it essentially goes into a registry. So the architecture of a solution like this is almost always consistently request management, which is typically list-driven or table-driven, etc. And then you have a essentially a registry, which is your actual, most likely your directory itself, right? Where you all have all your teams, all your SharePoint sites, all your Yammer communities, right? Don't limit it to just SharePoint Teams and Microsoft Teams. Like you can create Yammer communities, Facebook at work, whatever other tools you use in your organization, you can create those spaces in the same way using the same sort of approach. Now, each of these requests that we create, these processes, they always have at least some consistency. Most of them have a form, as we mentioned. They typically have some sort of usage policy, especially if it's the first time someone's creating these or requesting them. Typically there's the registry that we mentioned earlier. There's applying information policies and other things like that, asking probing questions, not just like, is this have confidential information, but sometimes you can word those in really clever ways to catch users who don't know how to validate whether or not something has something confidential. Like you could say, will this site ever be shared externally? Even with like maybe a file or two with a guest resource, is that something you expect to be able to do, that you need to do? And so we could ask those types of questions combined with questions like, well, you store information about our customers on it, or if you're a healthcare organization, you could ask certain questions around that, and then based on those responses you can already see the conflicts or the risks, right? And then work through a process of approvals and exceptions on the back end to manage that. The reason I mentioned the provisioning or the creation of the team, the site, the community in Yammer, that it needs to be automated is because you don't want this to delay the process. The idea isn't, hey, you could have just created the site this way, and now we're going to give you a new form which has more things you need to fill out, which is slowing you down already, and then you need to wait for the site to be created. The idea is you fill out those things. If you fill them out effectively, for most things we'll pre-approve or auto-approve. Only by exception will we handle like special approval discussions. Or you could even do things like, well, if you've created one before, for the second or third one, we've already kind of gone through this process. We're confident, kind of whitelisting. So you just kind of bring them in and they auto approve. But maybe a different group of people, first time they created it, or there's other risks, maybe with a specific department, etc. Then you might have them have additional approval steps. This allows for that flexibility that you wouldn't get with the out-of-the-box process. The other thing that's really great about this is there's no reason you couldn't involve the business in some of this creation. This is important because think of it this way. Let's say I say I'm creating an HR project site. I'm saying it's related to Department of HR, and I'm saying it's a project site. Well, when I go and create that site, even if you auto-approve it and it creates the site, there's no reason you can't notify somebody in HR that, hey, this site exists, because then they could even be proactive and do that due diligence for you, where they're like, oh, why are you creating this site? We already have one of these over here, and maybe catch these things earlier on. Another key part of this process is the form itself that you create for this request. It could have intelligence in the form that shows things like similar site names, or if you choose HR like I mentioned in project sites, maybe it just shows you all the HR and project sites on the right hand side. So it's less likely that you create the site if it's very obviously there on the right hand side with quick access to contacting the owner, etc. Fundamentally, one of the challenges that organizations run into here is that while they might create great request processes and they might understand how to build some of these things we're describing, it's very important to understand that there should not be any confidentiality in the name of a site or a space. So if I create a Microsoft team or a SharePoint site or a Yammer community, the name of that space, even if it's a private space, should never have confidential information in it. And that makes sense because you want the directory, right, the registry, to be visible to everyone. That way you can reduce redundancy. That way you can improve things quite significantly on the front and back ends for these experiences. So that doesn't mean they can't be secure. That doesn't mean that the content within them can't be private, but you want to avoid that. The other reason we actually encourage that, so we've gotten some pushback from some organizations where they're like, well, but if we make all the sort of registry or directory public, then someone will see that we have a salary site for whatever. And it's like, the question becomes, why are you naming it this way? Because I can guarantee that that resource, when they share their screen, has Teams open or something else open in the background and is not perfectly diligent that they're going to make sure that that site name isn't showing up somewhere else. So just don't put it in the site name, and your tabs, your your Teams, all these other experiences that you may inadvertently show when you're sharing your screen or working through stuff with other users in the organization is no longer a risk. So again, there's no valid reason not to have it be public. Now, this metadata that I mentioned, does it relate to HR, right? Does it relate to, what department does it relate to? Which does it relate to projects, etc.? Those questions are obviously very helpful, but they help in a lot of different ways. Now, I've talked through most of these, so I'm not going to go through it in detail again. But for your own reference, I think that this is a really good reason to explore the metadata or the questions and answers during the site creation or team creation, etc. It powers so many things that come from this. And here's some simple questions you might ask. These are the most common ones we see. Division or group in the business, department, product, customer, project. Does it contain highly confidential information? Again, there's better ways to ask that question. Who's the business sponsor? Because again, having that insight is extremely useful for approvals, escalations, things of that nature. Cost, revenue transfers as well. What should the visibility of this workspace be? And then this is a big question, because again, I really think that this last question should never be in the metadata questions, and we typically see it at first, and then we eventually get rid of it when we're successful in converting the organization to this idea that everything from a site name or team name should be public. But if that is a problem for your organization, you have some merger and acquisition sites. I don't know why you wouldn't create them in a separate tenant and manage it that way, but if you determine that that's something you want to do and you choose to take that risk, then obviously we can have an exception for some sites quite easily, right? You just essentially have those be different flags, and then you can have item level permissions or other ways to protect those particular items. If we're talking about like a SharePoint, or if you're building your own interface, you can of course control it. Here's another example of all this in play. So if you want to go play with it yourself, you can actually go to the URL below, or you can just Google it. And when you find this resource through Bing or Google, you'll actually be able to just download, install it, and set it up like any other Teams app. And when you create this app experience, it essentially allows you to have a Power App experience on the front end of creating these teams. Now, this allows you to expand. Out of the box, it doesn't have all these questions we're asking, but you can easily add those questions to this form, and you could manage it that way. It even has some clever things like I want to clone or create an existing request I've done before because I'm creating a similar project. I want to do things like see all my requests, see when I created them, have all that visible. So there's a lot of great ideas represented in this. We fundamentally don't think it should just be a Teams Power App. I think that's really important. So if you are going to do this, just make sure that that can be run in mobile. It can be run in a variety of environments, not just the traditional Teams one that's shown here, because like I said, it's for Yammer communities, it's for SharePoint sites, it's for a variety of other spaces, digital spaces for your digital workplace that exist, not just for Teams, which obviously this is designed around just Teams for your sample. But yeah, if you're looking at a starting point, this is certainly worth looking at. They use Power Automate to do the provisioning. Again, there's ways to avoid some cost by doing some other techniques for provisioning as well. So again, this is a really great resource to start with if you want to build it yourself, and for whatever reason you want to reach out to people like myself or organizations like TutorLead. But if you're looking to kind of do this kind of properly, I would look at third-party vendors, and I'd look at doing it with a friend, right? Someone who's built this many times before, because they can reuse that IP and hopefully not charge you for that IP that they've built, from building so many of these kinds of provisioning solutions over the years. We as an organization have built over 100, so it's highly likely between third-party products that might be better fit or solutions we've built before, all we really need to do is just tweak some metadata, right, in the creation process, which is much more cost-effective than trying to do this yourself. Another thing here is request forms. So the request forms that I mentioned earlier, they could be things like this Teams experience with an app, a Power App. They could also be a SharePoint FX web part or creation. I just wanted to at least explain why some organizations have kind of done something a little bit more advanced, I would describe, than just a Power App. The reason, aside from licensing for Power Apps, which may be a reason for a lot of organizations, one of the reasons for that is because you can actually embed it more effectively in other experiences. So let's say you have a beautiful modern intranet, and that uses SharePoint as the front end. in that beautiful modern intranet, you could create, your own request process and some other things using standard SharePoint FX controls and experiences and things like that. And that might be a really good fit for you because you really want to have a set of experiences where, yes, it's in Teams and has a certain experience, and when you're in SharePoint, it has another experience, and that's fine because you actually think about the spaces people are in and you kind of predefine some of the defaults, right? You might say, well, I can see that you're creating this site and you're in the HR department collection of sites in the intranet, so I'm going to assume that this relates to HR, right? So you can actually do some clever things based on where people are creating it if you, again, build some of these experiences yourself. The other opportunity here when you do this is there's nothing stopping you from potentially creating this and connecting it to other places where you might manage it in the back end. So a lot of our customers might use ServiceNow today, at least for provisioning management, and so maybe we have to use that as a solution for a variety of reasons. And if we're going to do that and we're going to pipe it together, then having lists as an intermediary may or may not make sense. It might make more sense to just directly connect the dots between ServiceNow and something like that. And that could be easier with Power Apps, or it could be easier with something like SharePoint FX. So these are situational discussions. So that brings up the next discussion, which is, okay, let's say we have a solution that has a registry, it has, the request process. What happens next? Well, that's where we can use that to do a lot of different things in the organization. We can do expiration or archiving policies where you can automate the archiving or automate the expiration in a variety of ways with different escalation points. You can look for duplicates because you actually have this registry. Even just a normal person could just filter and see a lot of duplicates by sorting by site name and looking at different does it relate to project, does it relate to department, and seeing that there's 3 sites in HR that relate to X, like, oh, okay, maybe those one of those might be a duplicate, etc. So whether it's an end user team that's determining duplicates or business owned group, or whether it's IT or somebody more centrally, there's great benefits there. There's certainly reduced risks, right, because we have more clarity on what spaces exist. There's public awareness of owners and things of that nature, or contacts. We can also do things like look for external sharing, which ones have been enabled for external sharing, which ones have confidential and also are externally shared, etc. We can associate teams and sites to SharePoint hubs. We can improve the information architecture on the back end, including improving hub alignment and other things automatically in the provisioning or even post-provisioning. Sometimes it can be a great way to find things that should be tied together for more traditional navigation patterns and roll-ups and things of that nature. We can provide training material. I'm going to give you an example of that in a second, where you can target proactively, very, very important, and so on and so forth. So there's tons of stuff you can do when you have that registry and directory. I want to use this particular example, and I'm going to zoom in because I know it's a bit hard to read on the type of content that you could do. But the core idea here is that you can improve management by having that registry, let's say, the directory experience. And now what we could do is we could proactively do reach outs. So here's an example, right? This particular site, this is a Microsoft Team and associated SharePoint site. It exists. It's called Project Holospace. And what we're doing is we're reaching out to the owner because there's a compliance gap. We're saying, hey, you need to have 2 owners. You're the only owner we see. You need 2. Otherwise, we're going to do something about that. Right? And then hopefully it's not some generic sentence like this. It's with clarity what will occur and what process will be followed. Inside of there, we help them understand which site and which Microsoft team we're referencing. We help them understand what compliance actions are required. In this example, this is just using Power Automate on the SharePoint list, right? So let's say your solution that I mentioned earlier just used a SharePoint list for the registry, and I have a bunch of teams and sites and communities and other things all represented in a huge list with a bunch of columns for things like which departments they relate to, etc. Now what I'm just doing is I'm setting up Power Automate that's going to look for any of those where the owner and secondary owner, etc., that is no longer effective, right? That when I do a check name or some other function, it's not going to find that user anymore because they've left the organization and so on and so forth. Because of course there's still a name there, right? It's just that user is no longer active. So then what we do then is we ask them to fill that out and take action. And this is nice because I'm automating the process here of, I'm not even saying you can go fill out the owner. I'm saying tell me, and then I'll even do that for you. I'll make sure that they're an owner. If they're not already one, I can set up the the registry, so now it's up to date, and so on and so forth for you, which might just be another little list with a Power Automate on the back end. Another key concept here is that we might do things like proactively suggest the owner. Now this is an example of a little bit more advanced Power Automate work, because what you're doing here is you're actually doing a call to determine who the most active user is within the team. This is not something that would be, the first step is very easy to do. This step is a good example of a more advanced step you could do in Power Automate, where you're calling probably code, and the code is going to check for most active user to make a suggestion. Again, these are things that you could do with Power Automate before. These are things that you probably would get if you talk to the user and just said, hey, can you set up the owner? They might say, well, who should I make the owner, right? So you might actually have to look at this stuff. And so doing these kinds of things can help. Instead of this, if you don't want to nominate the most active member like we're automatically doing here, you could just do something like, hey, if you're looking for the most active users, click on this, which is the report that's out of the box for your SharePoint site and so on and so forth, that can tell you who the more active users are, right? So we can kind of guide people towards out of the box reporting until, again, Microsoft Teams reporting, which may or may not be coming, etc. I'm dancing around NDA stuff, but when certain reporting is available, that you again will be able to utilize that. If you're using third-party tools, there's amazing third-party tools for reporting. You could also integrate them here quite easily. The idea is this is an programmatic, automatic, proactive motion that's happening based on the registry list where you're reaching out to the user. Now in here I also have some other interesting examples. So here we have not just that core compliance ask, but we actually have some suggested actions. One of them is we noted that there's 3 private channels. As I mentioned, private channels have their own challenges. So we're essentially helping them understand that these channels exist, and here's the owners. You as in your organization perhaps are saying you're still responsible for this, so you need to make sure you understand what's in these channels. Maybe add them to add you as an owner. If you shouldn't be the owner of those, then determine whether or not they should be separated as their own teams, so you're not responsible for them anymore. You've noted that the project is highly confidential, but you're actually using external access, and here's the number of people, etc. Again, some of this you could do really easily, because remember, when you create the site, you're asking questions like, does it relate to confidential? Does it have external access? And then some other ones might be more advanced things where you're looking at a Power Automate call that's checking who the external users are that currently have access to the site, or whether there's anonymous links, etc. Another one that you can do here is you, again, could have nothing that's fancy here. Instead of saying have not seen activity, you could just see if you're looking for information around channel activity to help determine if you should remove some channels or reduce redundancy, check out the usage on your team here, and then point to, again, maybe a third party or some other out-of-the-box tooling that gives you the reporting that you're looking for. Another great idea here is the recommendation. Again, these can be sort of static, written based on the insights that you're gathering, based on the metadata, if you will, of the registry. We can give people different recommendations. And then lastly, you can see even an example of a nominated program. So there's an automated Q&A program, which is something actually that Microsoft is working really great, doing really great work in Yammer around this. So automating Q&A is the first step before doing bots. And so maybe your organization is doing a program like that. And we think that your team is quite active, it's quite large. We'd love to start monitoring for questions and then suggest the answers to you and other owners, and then essentially help you save time and improve the way we track Q&A across the organization, which eventually leads into more advanced AI and digital assistance programs. So this is a whole separate discussion we can dive into some other time, but that's an example where you can just help them be aware of programs and opportunities for them or for their site or for their space. Another last one here, and sorry for being so small at the bottom, is here's the guidance pages, here's the training, here's the material for you. And you could do this. This is obviously one specifically for immediate feedback because there's an owner missing, but if you had just created this space, or it's 3 weeks after you created it or something like that, we could do a drip campaign where we send them particular guidance, training, and other resources that we know are pretty useful, and then we could track whether or not they've clicked through on those as well, right? Because you can create your own URLs for those links. So again, this is really not difficult to do, even though it looks a bit intimidating. And sending by email or Teams message or however you like best is very easy to do with Power Automate. So the key is this is possible because we have the site registry in the first place. Even if you didn't manage the requests and you allow for automatic creation of sites with out-of-the-box functionality, you could still manage a registry. It'd just be a lot more work. And if you did that, you could potentially do these kinds of proactive measures. And that's essentially the core discussion around governance. It's a short one because that's the magic, is the drip campaigns, the proactive targeting, those kinds of things that are now possible. So let's end our discussion today with what follows governance and the registry and the creation process, and that's the main problem we originally highlighted, which was navigation around Sprawl, right? Essentially, we have more and more of these spaces, SharePoint sites, teams, etc., Yammer communities that are get created. The out-of-the-box experiences are necessary but not sufficient, and they don't solve for this very, very real problem of navigation over time. And I'm a big intranet person. We've built a lot of intranets. We have Nielsen Norman Award winners in our team. Like intranets is a big deal for us, and the number one use case of an intranet is still navigation. So this is very close and dear to us. So as we mentioned, when you have a lot of teams, it's very difficult to navigate them. It's not better for the admins on the back end. So navigation is both for managers and organizers and things of that nature, as well as end users. And so you could say, well, okay, we have an intranet, and our intranet uses the wonderful out-of-the-box capabilities in Microsoft Viva or SharePoint Online that allow us to do things like have these awesome, mega menus. And the mega menus we have, even the global menu that we have now for Microsoft to complement the mega menus for our hubs, together those can solve these navigation problems. It's true that you can offset some of the more prominent sites where it's difficult to find, that showcase site or that core publishing environment, communication site as an example. But once you start to get into team sites like the collaborative environments, this just fundamentally does not scale. Not to mention, one of the reasons it doesn't scale is because the design of this, when you have a lot of sub-menu items, right, in the example of Microsoft's intranet right now as an example, you can see that when there's a lot of sub-items, it really doesn't scale. In fact, if you've ever done this, you actually have a scroll bar that you actually have to navigate inside of your mega menu when you have, for the third level, maybe 10 items under one of these columns, but all of a sudden push everything down and you'd have a scroll bar. So not only is this navigation not sufficient, because it doesn't really handle the volume of links that we would potentially need for all the team collaboration environments, etc. But it also fundamentally doesn't work because it's not really designed for the third level links, which is where most of these things would reside, right? Because you're just using categories for the top two levels for the most part. So you could do things like, okay, we'll create our own global nav. I hope you do. A beautiful new global nav for your intranet, and that should be built in using SharePoint FX. We've built hundreds of these. Again, please reach out to us if you're looking for something like this. Or there's third-party vendors that are amazing in the ecosystem as well that have, kind of intranet in a box, and they have solutions like this. And here's one example. Here you have the same mega menu concept, but it's a left rail where the right-hand side can have multiple columns, and those columns could have section layouts, etc. There's nothing stopping you from having a 4-level menu of depth, right, that Microsoft doesn't support out of the box, but you could support, as an example, where you have section headings and then a bit of organization to these columns. But because this could be designed this way, you can use an enormous amount more of real estate than what you could use potentially out of the box. What's more, it doesn't matter what stylistically it looks like. If you have a design that's more traditional there, or one where it's more of like a search experience and then it just surfaces different links, the main idea of having a left to right mega menu design is one of the reasons customers currently customize the out-of-the-box menus. Now, if you do that, it still doesn't solve our problem, unfortunately, even though this allows way more links than the previous mega menu design Microsoft uses from a design capability. It doesn't allow for the scale of hundreds or thousands of links that you're most likely going to have. So then there's a question of, well, what else does Microsoft offer? Well, another amazing solution Microsoft has is if you go to the SharePoint home, they have following, which is bookmarked sites. They have recent, right, where in the SharePoint world, they've done a really good job actually of creating dynamism, right, where you can actually see the most frequent, popular, and recent sites and so on and so forth, and then navigate to them quite easily. Now, this experience is great, but for most users, you have to go to the SharePoint home, which no user does. And while you could add this to using a web part called SharePoint Sites to an intranet page, it really doesn't scale or render it the way that we're talking about for directory style experiences. So this is great, and it's certainly the right idea, right? Recent, show me the recent sites I visited. Show me the frequent, popular, and recent sites I visit. Like those are, show me the ones I've bookmarked. These are capabilities we absolutely should incorporate into into our registry or our directory experience, but again, it's just not sufficient out of the box, specifically because it requires that extra navigation. So what else is coming? Well, what else is coming? We've got a beautiful left rail navigation experience, right, that's coming. And this left rail experience that Microsoft's providing does have a global menu, but the global menu is even more restrictive in the number of links and the layout than the one that we've already been talking about, which is the mega menu design. Not only that, but it does at least have frequent and followed. The problem with this is, while frequent and followed is amazing because it's the SharePoint functionality, until someday in the far future when Microsoft Teams and other things like pinned, followed, hidden, like there's other terms that Microsoft Teams uses to organize your teams, until those things are also represented in here, it doesn't really help you because it's not really a full registry or directory, it's just the SharePoint home experience brought into the left rail. Again, I cannot stress enough how happy I am with this because no one goes to the SharePoint home experience in real organizations, but it's still not sufficient for our directory needs. If we take a look at this inside of Teams, again, fundamentally with Viva Connect, it's a little bit better, but generally speaking, it just doesn't scale to the kind of links and the volume that we need to have, or the ways that you would want to filter it. So the traditional idea of a list view is still the best UX model for most of these directory experiences, right? Show me, hopefully, a pre-filtered view, like in this example where I'm looking up communities, show me the communities, and then show me information related to typical communities that might be relevant to me. Who's the managers? You know, in this particular organization, they're law firms, so which practice groups do they relate to, and so on and so forth. So each organization is a little different in the way that they might design these directories, but if we actually have those registries that we mentioned earlier, if that register or registry is built in out-of-the-box lists, then we can create as many views as we want. We can create pages, SharePoint pages, and create all sorts of predefined or pre-filtered views, and then have more traditional ways to link and click through and get to these pre-filtered views of that information. So again, that's one of the main reasons I just love SharePoint lists for a lot of this data, is because it gives you these kinds of experiences. Now, if you don't want to use that, I understand. Again, I would still store the data in a list, but I understand why some organizations don't. We also have worked with lots of organizations building alternative models. So here's an example where you can see here we have a more traditional mega menu design that's been brought into a Teams experience. So maybe you start with, let me start there, you start with more of like a traditional model here, right? Tools for the job, support functions, whatever your categories are. And then as you click on those, you see that sort of, say, mega menu design. Lots of potential links on the left rail, lots of sections or columns on the right, and then this is essentially mimicking that mega menu design that we were talking about. You could build a solution like this in Teams if you want, and you could have my links and all sorts of typical things that people request. But the other key concept is you could create a directory experience using that registry. And the registry could just be the name of, if you don't like the word communities, whatever, sites, teams, etc., digital spaces. And so digital spaces would be there, the name, the description, the type, and then again, I can't stress this enough, the additional metadata as well, right? So the department, the division, whatever information also is applicable. And so by doing that, you could create filters, you could create, the concepts of following, you could do all the things you might want to do. There's great third-party products, I mentioned one earlier, that have pre-built solutions like this, or you can work with companies like our own who've built a couple of them, and you can just use these as starting points. It doesn't need to look like this. It doesn't need to look like the out-of-the-box experience, right? The point is you can have a much better directory experience, A to Z, predefined filters and views, etc., for all your users, and you can surface that in all the experiences you want, whether that be in Teams, whether that be in SharePoint, because once you've built it once, in most cases, especially if you're using something like out-of-the-box lists or SharePoint pages, it's very easy to surface that in those other experiences, right, where users work. And so, so building a directory experience does not need to break the bank. It can be done with a couple $1,000s with out-of-the-box tooling, as I mentioned, with registries with an out-of-the-box list, or it can be, spend a couple tens of thousands of dollars to build a more advanced and streamlined and branded and designed one for your particular organization needs, based on your for larger organizations that see the value in that. But I just wanted to talk about this navigation thing where we take that registry and we start to bring it to the surface for end users. So we've talked about provisioning, governance, and navigation. Now we just want to wrap up, right? This is the discussion around those three areas for Sprawl, but there's other problems with Sprawl, right? A lot of organizations don't have an effective vision or strategy from a road mapping perspective. So if you think about governance, what's the adjustments to everything I mentioned for intranets? How does provisioning change for intranets? How does the approvals change for the intranets? How might some of those navigation experiences change? The same thing might go for organizations that have document management, real focus on document management. How might you surface knowledge management or document management in different ways, or how might that affect the things that I mentioned earlier, the provisioning, those kinds of logic things. Even something as simple as Viva Topics has an impact on our strategy here, because those Viva Topic pages can absolutely they actually have an out-of-the-box functionality to point to Teams and SharePoint Sites as an example that relate, and so you want to really connect those dots as well, right? So there's some ways that you can actually leverage Viva Topics to further enhance these directory experiences as well. So there's lots of stuff to talk about that we didn't have time. I hope that if you have any of those questions or some of the things we talked about today spark your interest, you'll reach out. My email address is there. I really prefer a one-on-one call, because then I can show you customer examples. I can show you a little bit more NDA kind of material, and we can have a deeper discussion that's more prescriptive, right, based on where you're at. But with that, thank you all for your time, and I hope you have a wonderful conference.